We're here at Admiral's Hard, just opposite the Royal Marines Barracks in Stonehouse. This is the only street in the whole of the country which has the name Admiral's Hard, and it's quite significant to its history. As you can see, this beautiful structure behind is one of the early original features of one of the high status buildings from the Georgian era along Darnford Street. This house, along with many along this street, would have been occupied and frequented oftenly by some of the common names that we remember today, such as Nelson, Bligh, Cook and Wolfe, would have walked these very streets. Without doubt, this section of road would have seen them on an often basis as they would come to dine with other captains and admirals who did live here, or to reside with them for short periods while the ships were being refitted or victualled, ready for their next service. This section of road still leads along its original footprint down to what is known as the Admiral's Hard. It was owned by the Earl of Mount Edgecombe and has been in use since the 13th century, when the first crossing by rowboat, which would have been in use to cross to the other side of Devon, which is now Cornwall, where the Earl resided at Cremel, or just off from Cremel. This part of Stonehouse was born from the Royal Navy. It was grown through empire and warfare, and much of it still survives today. You're surrounded by the large barracks, the Royal William Yard just to the south, which was constructed to serve these very naval ships and to make sure that they got the necessary food and water that they needed to service the ships as they went out for sometimes up to 2 years service all around the world, to places like New Zealand, the Americas, South America and the Caribbean, South Africa. Bearing in mind that these ships couldn't pass through the Suez Canal because it hadn't been constructed, so the long journey was often taken down around South Africa, which was a perilous route, could take from 2 months, sometimes as long as 6 months, just to reach New South Wales, or Australia as we know it today. The Admiral's Hard still exists and is as busy as ever today, as people use the ferry to cross over to Cremel for a day at Mount Edgecombe. The history is still here and still linked to this area. The Admiral's Hard was a vital part of the local area because as ships returned from service, they would pass through the Sound, around Drake's Island, saluting the shore with a gun battery. Depending on their service at sea, whether it was 6 months or longer, they were permitted to do a broadside, which would signal to the town that a ship had returned, and trade would come flooding down to see the sailors, who obviously had coin to spend and the need for food and ale, and obviously other pleasures. This section was reinforced because as the ships would enter the Hamoaze and then be moored up and anchored, the captains would be rowed ashore to the Admiral's Hard, where they would disembark to return to their house to live in splendour once again, whilst the guns were taken across to the gun wharfs, and the wounded or sick men would be rowed up Stonehouse Creek just in front of us, which spawned the old fable up the creek without a paddle, as there were 2 huge hospitals there which still survive today, one being the Royal Naval Hospital, built in 1767, and the other being the General Service Army Hospital, which is 1797, which is Devonport High School for boys today. Stonehouse Creek was a vital part to the local economy. It's had timber yards. It serviced Devonport and Stonehouse and linked them together. This link was not through commercial or local use, but was mainly so that the Marines could get to the dockyard, to the ships and to the barracks. A bit slippy here. You can see the mud flats behind. This is just silted up, but for all we know, we don't know what is underneath here even to this day. We know that just to the north here there was a Roman villa found, during excavations, which is now under Princess Yachts. They found Roman offerings and so on, which are the oldest remains to date found within this vicinity prior to the Catdan Caves. The name Stonehouse itself derives from the finding of this Roman settlement, Stonehouse, because allegedly when the Saxons arrived with their tradition for wooden houses, they found this stone house, this stone structure, which they refer to as Stonehouse, and then the name was born, which is still stuck to this day. In my hand I have some locally found artefacts related to the Royal Navy and the Marines, etc. These have all been found locally and they're in abundance. You find them in the silts, in the soils, all around. We have musket flints, ship's nails, Royal Naval captain's buttons from the 1790s, complete with their gold gilt. We have cross-belt badges, buckles, and even a surgeon's pewter syringe, which we can only imagine would have been a last resort of desperation to treat a sailor.
Does that unscrew still, Wes?
It does indeed, which is quite fascinating. It's made from pewter as well, but when you think this is a very early medical implement and yet you can still screw and unscrew even after it's been in the ground for some 200 years with a little squeak.
Makes you wonder where that's been.
Yes, there was a number of applications for these, but it was common for what we refer to as STDs, where they would inject mercury into a man. But he would be screaming, obviously, because this wasn't a subtle syringe like we'd think of today. It would have been a quite crude, long iron stem on it.
Thank you, Wes.
It's all right.